We have several presentations tonight on the budget. Bernie, take us through it, please.
Good evening. We'll begin looking at the 2020, that's hard to believe, budget, with an enrollment update. Back in November 1st, I provided a report to the board regarding our capacities in our buildings and our enrollment at the time. So tonight we'll go through an update providing you with information regarding where we stand as of now. So, broad brush, the big picture. Our K-5 enrollment is where we are seeing growth. While overall district enrollment may be declining, and particularly at the upper grades, at the enrollment level, we are seeing an anomaly with growth. If we look at last year, March 16th, 2018, we were right in the midst of our budget development and presentations, and our projections for enrollment were at 3,379 students at the K-5 level. Not too far off from the demographer's projections, and typically they have been very, very close. By September, our actual enrollment was up to 3,535 students, K-5. By November 1st, 3,562. December 13th, 3,596. January 9th, 3,620. And as of January 28th, earlier this week, we're up to 3,631. That is a 252 student increase at the elementary level since last March in the projections. Very significant growth. So what impact is that having on the district? Well, we had talked about what our classroom capacities are at each of the buildings back in November, and I've reflected what that is here on a building-by-building basis. And I want to remind the board and the community that what actual classroom capacity means is it's a very simply a formula. How much square footage exists in the classroom, and how many students can you fit in the classroom? It is a state formula that does not take into consideration class size. So it doesn't matter what the class sizes could be. They could be 30, but it doesn't matter. It says what your capacity could be at the maximum possible number of students that can fit into a space. The target or optimum utilization for those classrooms is set at a percentage of the actual capacity. And that's just looking at the building, not necessarily the classrooms individually. If we look at these numbers for what the target utilization is versus what our K-12 or K-5 enrollment was on January 28th, every one of our elementary schools, except Central, exceeded those capacities. Every single one. When we look at our total enrollment, and that's K-5, and what that adds into it is our ELA program, our Early Learning Academy program, which is housed basically taking up 5 classrooms in the district. And that increases even further the utilization within the buildings. So in total, for K-5, as of earlier this week, January 28th, we had 3,793 students in our elementary schools. Our optimum utilization for those schools was for 3,243 students. We have no room in our schools. Let me go through school by school what class sizes look like. So these are average class sizes. Let's start with kindergarten. And up in the top right corner of the slide, you'll see what our ranges are per board policy. There's a minimum, a maximum, and what the optimal enrollment would be for those grades. Kindergarten. Central, we have 22 students on average per class. Chittick, 23. Frost, 22. Lawrencebrook, 27 on average. I can't express enough that this is an anomaly that could not be anticipated. This isn't related to construction. We can't say where the students are coming from, but they're moving into district. And it's having a direct impact on our class sizes. To mitigate these issues, we have added staff to class sections where they've exceeded what our ranges are, what our established ranges are. And in cases, we have had to seek approval from the Department of Education to exceed certain limits. There are no classrooms available to be able to create additional sections. Grade 1, our class sizes. Again, on the high end, 21, 20, 26, 24 students in grade 1. Much too high for this grade level. Grade 2, all of the schools are in the 20s. 22, 22, 22, 23, 21, 21. At grade 3, at Bound Monroe, the average class size of grade 3 is 24 students. At Chittick, it's 28. Frost, 24. Lawrencebrook, 23. Grade 4, except for Lawrencebrook, all of the class sizes are in the 20s. And at grade 5, Chittick, Frost, Irwin, Lawrencebrook, Memorial, Warnsdorfer, all in the 20s. So, what does this mean? Well, if we take our class sizes and our current enrollment and use our projections, our straight line projections, which basically take what our enrollment is now and moving all of our students up a grade, we are still short on classrooms. There may be a slight reduction in what the overall enrollment may be for September, and again, without being able to predict this unusual circumstance that we've been having, but we are still short on classrooms. And breaking down each of the schools and bringing our class sizes into the ranges that are established by policy, we would need 1 classroom at Bound, 1 classroom at Central, 2 at Chittick, 4 at Frost, 1 at Irwin, and Irwin, by the way, does not have a room for music. Music is without a classroom. They're now taking over the stage. And they're in the multipurpose room, which you have music going on at the same time that PE is happening in that area. And by the way, then when PE is not there, we have lunch.
And they're also utilizing their Flex Lab space.
And the Flex Lab space is not available to the school as a Flex Lab.
Right.
They have to use it for small group instruction areas. Lawrencebrook, 7 classrooms. Memorial, 1 classroom. And this is to bring class sizes into acceptable ranges.
I have a question. If Central is, on one of your earlier charts, it's the only one that was not red, so there's supposedly capacity, why is there still?
Because when we look at capacity, it's just looking at how much square footage is in the building and how many students can you fit into the building. It doesn't look at, well, how many classrooms do you have and what are your optimal number of students? So you may have some square footage, but it may not be in the right place. It could be maybe in 5th grade, and I'm just throwing this out as an example, maybe you have room in 5th grade, but your growth is elsewhere and you need a classroom. Now, while you may need that classroom at another grade level in this year, that will end up moving as that pocket of students advances through the grades. Does that
One-
make sense?
One of the things that we talked about earlier, before this meeting tonight, was that, these trends are troubling because it's not just little pockets here and there. They are consistently coming. And if this trend continues, we are going to be in a much different place by September of 2019 if we don't take some action. And that's what we're looking at literally every 2 weeks in terms of our enrollment.
You look like you have a question.
I do. Well, because you have every elementary but Warnsdorfer on here, and Warnsdorfer is also in the red. I'm just wondering, why are they not in need of an additional classroom? It looks like there's 15 or so extra.
Because with the movement in the enrollment for next year, the class sizes, we're able to make adjustments and not have to add a classroom for next year. So
Based
I'm
on
showing
current-
you
So they're in the
what-
red for this year, but for next year they're
For
going to be...
next year, they'll probably be okay. Now, we've been monitoring enrollments pretty regularly at this point, just watching almost from day to day and week to week because it's changing so significantly. So we'll continue to monitor that, and that can change.
Okay.
But right now, it looks like Warnsdorfer will be okay. Mr. Seeler?
The projected classroom needs, does that include the Early Learning Academy? Does not include the Early Learning Academy
The projected classroom?
needs?
That is taking into consideration that we are not removing the 5 classrooms being used by the Early Learning Academy. And here's the issue with that. If we say, well, let's move Early Learning Academy out, well, we have to put them somewhere. We don't have any space anywhere to house those 5 classrooms. So we have a couple of issues that come from that. One, we have an obligation to the community. We're servicing students in this community in each of those classrooms. That program provides revenue, and you'll see me talk about that as we get into the next portion of the presentation, that offsets the budget. We cannot afford to lose that revenue. So we've got a couple of issues here. Now, while we're looking at what options might there be to perhaps move Early Learning Academy, that doesn't come without a cost. Anywhere that we were to move the ELA to, that is not a district site, where we would either have to rent or purchase, that comes with a $sign. And then the next question is, how do we pay for it? So we're going to have to pay one way or another. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
And also, moving those classes out doesn't solve the problem, because the need exceeds the classrooms available.
That's
from
correct.
ELA.
And the classrooms, some of the classrooms may not be in the right schools for the right purpose. So that's something that we really have to be concerned with. Mr. Hahn?
So we are talking about 2019. There are a lot of development going on in the township. So what kind of impact do you anticipate those new buildings, townhouse and condos, all those, and single house, to our school class size?
The short answer to that right now is, I don't know. We have asked our demographer to come back in and update the report. It's time for it to be done. We've got some new developments that have started to come on the books that were not previously known. For example, there's a 50 townhome development in Ferris Farms. Ferris Farms that is coming up. That is going to have an impact, and we've got several others that are coming down the road as well. So those projects will need to be looked at to see what the impact will be on our schools. This is just looking at the immediate. This is not giving you the long term. Yes, sir.
All right. It's a two-part question. So I'm looking at the K through 5 enrollment screen that you had up before. We're showing a 252 increase, which you pointed out. Where are you seeing the concentration of those students coming in on the K through 5 distribution? Because when I start to add up the averages of your later slides on the K through 5, I'm showing a smaller average on the K with 161 aggregate based on the averages across the board, and then increasing in the later in the later classes. Was it an equal distribution when those students came in, or was it more heavy?
Everywhere.
It was equal across the board?
I can't say equal, but we're seeing the enrollments happen across the board in all the grades. Changes are happening throughout the grades. I don't have the drill down for you on that, but we can provide that.
We can get that.
Okay.
But we see that we need the greatest amount of classrooms right now at Lawrenceburg.
Yes. Yes.
But other buildings are close behind, you know, in terms of
Well,
the impact. So you have frost. So, you know, and these things can change because we have class sizes that are creeping up. So when we're looking at the optimum class sizes, it could, just a number of a handful of students. When you talk about 11 students enrolled over literally the last 19 days.
Yeah, but in a way, this makes sense, if you will. Take my neighborhood, Lawrenceburg, for example. Lawrenceburg is the oldest neighborhood in town. There is a very large population of people my age, with kids my age, who have just become empty nesters. It's very cyclical, but our kids' classes were very large as they went through the district. And more and more, these are the homes that are for sale in my neighborhood. People that I know who had kids who went through Lawrenceburg with my kids. Who's buying them? Families with young children. They're not selling them to other empty nesters. They're finding themselves with large homes that they don't need. So if you look also at Frost, Frost is also an older development. So again, in years past, going back 12, 10, 8 years ago, our high school graduating classes were larger. So again, these are people who are becoming empty nesters now from very large class sizes. So I'm not surprised to see Lawrenceburg with the largest amount of classes that we need, and Frost either. So I think that we can do some due diligence, even just within our own town, with the demographer in terms of that. Which neighborhoods are turning over?
And that's interesting because that's something I think the demographer did a good job of in terms of the analytics and the metrics they use to forecast birth rates, the turnover of property, aging of the population, regeneration of the population. But it appears like what we're seeing is outside the analytics and outside the quantitative analysis the demographer did. We don't know what it is yet, but there's something going on where people are just coming here, and I just don't know what's drawing them. I haven't seen the sign on the turnpike yet, but there must be one.
The fact that we've got a great reputation and everything, we win lots of awards, we're a very visible district. I don't know. Yeah. They want to live here. It's not Route 18. It's not what's bringing them here.
So, in the short term,
Yeah.
we are looking at what do we need to do to bring in temporary classroom units? Looking at how the sites, whether the sites can accommodate them, what the cost is, and as far as accommodating, it's not just the room that may be available on the property, but is there sufficient electrical load to be able to power? Is there an appropriate sewage system to be able to tie into? What's the water service? Those are all components that have to be taken into consideration. And of course, the cost. What is the cost for renting or purchasing the units? And then there are also going to be one-time costs for installation. There could be foundations involved and so forth.
And the staffing cost.
We're not even talking about
Right,
staffing.
and we have to have teachers for every one of those
We need
classrooms.
teachers for every one of these.
Right.
Bernie, would you also just let the board, talk to the board for a minute? There is a limit on how many years we can have temporary classrooms. And there's also a provision in there, isn't it, that we must have plans to demonstrate to the state that we are doing something about this for a permanent solution rather than
So-
temporary?
So let's first define temporary classroom unit. What is that? It's
Trailer.
a trailer.
Right.
The trailers are very nice. Some of them are going to be nicer than, honestly, some of the classrooms. I know Mrs. Reese doesn't believe that, but.
She's writing this
but-
down. She's
but-
quoting you.
But the ones that are built now are much different than those of, a few years ago.
Right, but there's still provisions on,
But the provisions, in response to your question, it's a 5-year time frame. You can utilize, so a school district can utilize temporary classroom units for a period of 5 years, but the school district must have a plan in place. What is the plan to eliminate the use of those units? Now, a question that had come up at one point recently was, well, at what point in time can we get an extension perhaps? The Department of Education will not look kindly on an extension. They will want to see that there has been progress toward a plan. What is the plan? What are we doing to alleviate these issues? Do we have a building plan in place? Have we attempted to ask the community for funding for a building plan? Because if we have done nothing, the Department of Education will not look well on that. So can I tell you exactly what will happen? I can't. I don't have that crystal ball, but it's a 5-year period of time, and we have to be actively doing something to relieve the issue during that period of time.
And one example we would have to look to is Monroe Township is going through this right now, and they're going to referendum, and they currently have trailers. They're trying to, they're trying to get out of and build permanent structures for. So we have somebody very close by we could look at and see what their experience has been with dealing with the department and the kind of, communication they've had with the Department of Education, how many waivers or extensions they've gotten, and, that would be a good example for us to look at.
it wasn't that long ago that we had trailers at the high school and Hammersholt.
Right,
Okay? And Hammersholt.
right.
I know some of you have gone through East Brunswick. I don't know if the trailers were there when you went, but as recent.
Yeah, we had.
You were the best.
Right, as recently as my children both went to schools
I
with
tell her all the
trailers.
time.
So we can look towards our own experience also. It's livable, it's doable, it's not horrible. Learning a good learning experience could happen on a desert island, let's face it, okay? As long as you have a really good teacher who can engage kids and motivate kids to learn. They can teach them in a trailer, they can teach them in a classroom, but obviously that's not what we want.
No, but as I understand what Dr. Valesky said, in Monroe, I believe it's their 7th grade, and I was told that they're doing something where if there's 4 sections, half the kids will be in the classrooms, and then half the kids spend the days in the trailer, and their classrooms are all there. They go inside for gym and lunch, but other than that, they spend the full
Well,
day.
there's a
in
lot
the
of ways to do it.
classroom.
When we had them at Hammersholt, it was just like another hall. It was, you had a class there, then you had a class back in the
Right,
building, a
right.
class there. There's a lot of ways we could go, but the most important takeaway from this is what Bernie said. At the same time that we're planning how to deal with this, we must start a plan to permanently solve this, okay? So, because it's going to take years. So it's a lot of big decisions coming down the pike for us. We can do it.
Well, we've already done this part, questions.
You already did that one.
Already did that.
Jeff?
In response to something you had said regarding the demographic shift with the empty nesters and moving out. Now, I know the most recent census in town stated that the average age here now is 45 to 55 non-child bearing, essentially, families. And we are not set up to handle what the township has slated for their 3 to 5 year plan. This is a huge issue. With what's being proposed, you're looking at an influx, and speaking to the township, of probably close to 2,500 students across the board if they get everything they're looking for. So,
We're going to be putting up tents on your front lawn.
I was going to say, yeah,
We're
well,
going to
the
have-
farm is available
There's
for
going to be
education.
trailers,
Yes.
and there's going to be the off-site classrooms, and we're
Right.
doing a lot of online
Yeah.
classes.
Okay.
We'll figure it out. We'll figure it all out together. We've got a lot of good people giving us information. We have a great team, and we've got a great board, so we're going to figure it out. I don't know how, but we're going to do it.
One step at a time.
One step at a time.
There's no doubt we'll figure it out.
Where are we going from here? We going up from here?
Well,
The next
from
report?
Our next, we're going into the next piece on the school budget. And obviously, the enrollment that we just discussed will have an impact on the school budget. But let's talk about some high-level issues, factors impacting the bottom line. So as we are in the development process now, and the board will begin to have budget presentations beginning this evening, what are the factors affecting it? So on the revenue side, it's state aid, number one. We don't know what will happen with state aid. At the very best, or the very least, depending on one's perspective, one can hope that state aid will remain stable. There'll be no reduction. We can also hope that there might be an increase in state aid. But I'll remind the board that while there was an increase in state aid last year, the district itself did not benefit from that increase because a majority of those funds went directly to the charter school. It was over 80% of the funds that we received that were above and beyond the year prior, over 80% went to the charter school. So we really benefited very little from that.
But Bernie, even what you just said about the choices in state aid, when you talked about stay the same, flat funding, that's a decrease because everything goes up.
That's correct. And, you know,
So
we've
flat funding is not a good option.
we've become Pavlovian dogs
Right.
in that we hope for the same rather than looking forward to state aid amounts that will actually mirror what it costs to support the educational programs. And it's been like that for a very, very long time. So we've learned to accept, well, keep it flat, don't hurt us, rather than to expect that it be, you know, keeping pace. Even though it never really kept pace, but at least there were increases in the past. And by the way, one of the things I'll be talking about in a future presentation is, you know, where are we in terms of our state aid in comparison to where we were several years ago? Because remember, for those of you that were here and those that weren't, you'll see the information that shows that our state aid is actually less than it was several years ago. I think it was 2010. 2010, we saw drastic reductions in our revenue as a result of state aid cuts and the taking of our reserve balances. And at the same time, that was the first year of implementing the charter school, which was an additional hit on the budget of nearly, I think it was nearly $2 million at the time. It was $1.2 million. Apologize, it was about $1.2 million that wiped out our elementary world language program. So there's a little bit of history there. 2% cap. We are fixed with a 2% cap on the tax levy. So we cannot grow the budget beyond that without having a second question. And the interesting thing about that is if we were to have a second question, and I'm not promoting that, but if we were, you don't have it at the same time that the budget is being adopted. That comes in November for the public to vote on it, and so then the funding, if it were to be approved, wouldn't come until after that. Well, if you need teaching staff in September and you don't have a vote for the additional teaching staff until November, it's unlikely that you're going to make those kinds of changes at that point in time. So some more information to just keep in mind. Budgeted fund balance. We generate out of our budget each year leftover funds that we have to ensure are sufficient to then roll over into the next year. We provide roughly $4.5 million in funds that are left over at the end of the year to go into the next year's budget. We have to generate that. It's something that we have built in, and each year we have to look toward being able to save resources, not spend our budget down to the last dollar, because we'll need that leftover to go into the following year. That make sense? And then enterprise operations, and that is our programs in the Early Learning Academy, our before-school program, our after-school programs. They generate funds, and those programs, funds go to help support the budget. On the expenditure side, what are the high-level issues? Well, we've had unanticipated services this year in special ed. We have had unanticipated staffing needs across the board, both in special education and with the class size issues, that we have had to hire staff that were not budgeted. So those are impacts in the current year that will have an impact in next year's budget. Special education tuition is an ongoing issue. We've talked about that previously, and we've had some spikes this year, and trying to use the crystal ball to figure out how is that going to impact us in the next year, because it certainly is having an impact this year. Transportation costs are ever increasing. You'll hear a little bit about that in a few minutes when we talk about the next, the budget in phys ed and athletics. But transportation costs, we have some significant issues in this state. We have a shortage of bus drivers. We cannot get companies to bid on routes. They're bidding very high when they do bid. We have had a couple of companies this year that we've dealt with that have shuttered their doors and are no longer in business. So there is a squeeze on the available services out there, which then drives up the cost. Collective bargaining has an impact. What are the results of collective bargaining in terms of costs on our budget? Charter school costs, I talked about that earlier. And again, not being able to project at this point, what will that be? What is the impact on the budget for next year? And we don't determine that. The state tells us how much we have to budget for the charter school. And of course, where we started, and that is the K-5 enrollments and the growing class sizes. So these are high level, 20,000-foot look down on what we're looking toward.
And just one comment, Bernie, if you could go back to you right there. So I don't want to go too deep into this, but we'll talk about it later in budget development. But when we talk about the charter schools, this year alone, we have had 3 students from the charter school placed in out-of-district programs at their doing with very little interaction with our child study team. Those students go to those out-of-district placements, we pay the bill, not the charter school. And the transportation costs, they're our responsibility for the charter school.
Let me ask you something. If the charter school does not have the program to support a particular special needs child, and it's recommended that they go out of district.
Right.
But we have the program in district. Is it possible
It is, to bring that child
to
back
bring
to
that
our
child
program.
back to our program?
It is possible.
To save that money, but to
Right.
provide them with still the best education we can?
It
Right.
certainly is possible.
But those
It's
programs
driven
cost.
it's driven by communication.
And this programs cost money and take space. So we're back to the circle again.
Right, but say we have a special ed class for autistic children, for instance. So if a child is identified as autistic when they're in the charter school,
Right.
and their action plan is to send them somewhere else and pay out-of-district tuition to the cost of $50,000, $70,000, $100,000 a year, but we have a program that will support that child, give that child an excellent education, and we have the room, do we have the right to say, no, they're not going out of district? We can educate them in-house?
It's a little more complicated than that. Renee, would you mind?
I'm,
Just
I
answering
know,
that
this may
question.
sound very naive, but,
No, it's, I think it's an important point.
Yeah, it's the right question.
I don't understand.
We actually are in a situation similar to that right now. And the charter school actually writes the IEP. So if they decide that they want to send a student out of district, they have every right to send a student out of district, and we get the bill.
But why can't they send them out of district to us?
They could. They could.
So that gets into what I meant, you heard me say,
I'm
it
sorry,
comes
I-
down to the
It
communication
just doesn't make
aspect.
sense to me.
And that's where the
You're right.
communication is key, where there needs to be a line of discussion where the charter school would come to our child study team
Right,
services
right.
and have the conversation so that we can make an appropriate decision. But we're kept out of that conversation.
So can I just, Ms.
That
Becker,
doesn't seem
the
right.
question you asked, the answer is yes. They could come to us. The bottom line is it's not part of the conversation at this time, but it needs to be.
And who's
So-
who's that driven by? Is that driven by,
The charter school.
Right.
That's nuts.
well, wait, but then the money that is given to the charter school from our budget, and they're making that decision unilaterally,
Correct.
seems like there should be a deduction in what we give them. I mean,
There is not.
And that.
There is not.
That's-
There's no what, was there, is there a deduction?
No, there's no deduction.
That
So-
makes 0 sense.
So,
Of course,
Renee,
this is absurd.
It's a bad
There's no
contract.
deduction in the
It's a bad arrangement
cost.
between us
So-
and the charters.
so what happens,
Hello,
you've got a couple of
DOE.
pieces of the transaction. You have the out-of-district tuition costs, which become our expense. The transportation associated with that becomes our expense. And by the way, for the charter school, we are responsible for providing transportation for all the students in the charter school.
Right.
That is the school district's responsibility. The offset to that student that is placed in an out-of-district placement by the charter school would be that that student would no longer be on roll with the charter school, would
Right.
become our student
You
by
give up a gen,
default.
you get reduction for a gen ed seat, you play for an out-of-district
Yes,
placement, essentially.
That's the offset.
So, one of the things that we talked about earlier today, because we were analyzing this situation, and I'm just gonna put this out there for board communication, I would like to reach out to our legislators,
Yeah.
to our assembly
Yes.
woman and our senator, have a conversation, invite selected board members to that conversation to talk about the impact to East Brunswick Public Schools. Because I think the legislation needs to be looked at.
Mark,
I mean, I just have a question too, I guess. So they're, I assume, in control of their own budget. So if they drive their costs from their budget up with no
Where-
input from us, it seems to be that we're bearing some costs. Like you said, 80% of the state aid that we got went to them or whatever. It just seems to me that these costs, like if their budget isn't responsible, which I don't know if it is, I will qualify that statement, but it just seems to be that it has the potential, if it's not already doing it, to drive up the costs. us, to our taxpayers.
The charter school's budget is driven by its, not only what its costs are, but what are its revenue sources. And so, the revenue source that we provide is based on a formula. The state derives that, and the formula is driven by enrollment. What is the projected enrollment for the charter school, and by what our per pupil costs are. Those are the factors that go into deriving how much they receive from us. We're not the only ones providing funds.
Yeah, it
But-
just seems
but
to
let's
keep
say it
going
was
up
just
though, right?
a-
It's been
It
consistently
has been
going
going
up.
up, so as our costs increase, it increases the per pupil cost, the charter school receives more money.
Okay.
Does this only for the children going out of district, does this only apply to the children that are current East Brunswick residents going to the charter school? Or are we?
Yes.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
Strict,
There are
yes, we are responsible
we're
for
not-
East
okay.
Brunswick resident children. We're not responsible for other students
because I
that,
know they have a large
that would be
number.
attending the
I-
charter school.
I figured, but I just wanted to double check.
Of their total capacity, which is now I believe 600 students, we send, I believe, 196 students of that 600. The rest are coming from other districts.
How many of these students are being sent?
Not even one-third?
how many students have done?
That have gone out of district? Well, we have one that recently occurred. I know that we've had three 3 in your time here, and I know that there were others prior to Renee's time here with the district, so it's happened.
Well, I'm going to echo a word that Mark used. If that is happening, that is what I wouldn't call that responsible budgeting, because their responsibility is to educate the students in the best possible manner while upholding a fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayers. And if that is being bypassed for any other reason, then we should absolutely have some way to appeal that, whether it's bringing in, talking to the legislatures. I'm sorry, but nobody should be enabled to be irresponsible when it comes to the taxpayers' money.
And you said, just maybe clarification, you said we're responsible for all the transportation costs.
Yep.
Since only a percentage are East Brunswick kids, are we responsible just for the East Brunswick children's
We are
transportation costs?
responsible for all transportation costs pertaining to our resident students.
Okay, but and then my question would that be, even if it's just our residents, I guess there would be some type of overlap where a bus route may pick up one student that's going there, and then the next bus that's going to one of our public schools here might be picking up 7 students from the same corner. And I know you don't know that, and that would be something to figure out, but I'm just thinking like,
Yeah.
there has to be overlap there.
There is a potential for that.
Yeah, yeah, so you see what I'm saying,
Right.
like if we had 8 kids at a bus stop, we could
Right.
fit it on this bus, but,
Right.
you know, it's just a,
And the question, and this might be the legislatures who set this, are there any parameters around, based on all of the things that we're doing for these charter schools, can we get a seat at their table? No.
We've invited them to our table, so we have a meeting of the Middlesex County Roundtable, which is all the superintendents in Middlesex County. Tikva has never shown up at that meeting in the entire time I've been with East Brunswick.
And then, okay, then the follow-up to that would be, and based on what we said before, if we have the resources, shouldn't there be something in place mechanically that would give us first right of refusal on that student?
Of course there should.
There should be.
None of this-
But is that legislative or is that?
Legislative.
It is
Unfortunately-
legislative.
But there's actually a law, so when you have a child with special needs, they have to be placed, they're entitled to a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. So you don't send a student with special needs out of district at your first instance. If you can accommodate that student in the public schools, that's the least restrictive environment. So it almost seems like, and I don't know any of these kids individually, certain kids, the out-of-district placement is the appropriate placement. But you might have decisions being made at the charter school, putting a kid into a far more restrictive environment, where this would be the least restrictive environment, because they want the children to interact with the greatest group of kids.
Absolutely.
So that's something that when we talk to the legislatures, that's the law. That's statutory law under both federal law and state law. And you can't have a regulation, because most of these charter school things are codified in the regulations in Title 6A. So you really shouldn't have a regulation trumping a law and trumping a student's individual federal rights and state and constitutional rights to the least restrictive environment.
Jeff, I think what you were alluding to was a lack of oversight and a lack of our ability to have any oversight over their accountability to be fiducially responsible. And that's always been an issue.
Or the district taking a legal stance, finding out what these 3 other schools have, and if they are on parity with what we offer, I think legally, we should be able to make a case to bring them back in due to non-differentiation for,
That's what Renee is working on.
That's
yeah.
what, yeah.
oh,
And
sorry. All right, you do that then. There you go.
she said you could do it.
We got it.
I crossed it out.
All right, well,
Okay.
I think that, this
Good
charter
discussion.
school being a
Was good.
source of
Thank you.
frustration
Thank you.
is a conversation we will always continue to have. But,
Moving right along.
yeah,
So we have some key budget dates. We will be busy with budget presentations through March 14th and doing our budget development in the back room in the meantime. Budget addressed by the governor is currently slated for March 5th. I've heard some rumblings that there might be a change to that. I did hear an announcement that state aid is to be released March 7th. March 14th would be our tentative budget adoption. The public hearing would then be April 25th, and the final budget adoption is scheduled for May 9th. You have a quizzitive look on your face.
No, I'm just still frustrated.
Oh, okay. So that was,
Sorry.
I misinterpreted the look.